So the first question actually to Dr. Alexander Leicht is the Global Action Program on ESD aims at the structural implementation of ESD at national policies. What's the relevance of this goal actually, and how can higher education institutions contribute to achieve this ambition? So this is the first question to start our online panel, and I'd like to Dr. Alexander Leicht, now from UNESCO Paris, to start your introduction. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Mada. Thank you very much, Clemens. Thank you also for inviting me and inviting UNESCO to be part of this panel and of this first session of the course. I think it's a very good opportunity to share through this format here a number of our consideration with regard to driving education for sustainable development at the global level. I would, in the 10 minutes that I have, I would briefly address in the first part of my short talk the Global Action Program on Education for Sustainable Development generally. What is it trying to do as a global policy framework for ESD? And in the second part of my short contribution, I would discuss the implications for higher education. And then I understand later on in the session we have further opportunities to develop that further. Let me start by the Global Action Program on Education for Sustainable Development. As you indicated, the Global Action Program builds on the UN Decade of ESD that for 10 years, from 2005 to 2014, tried to implement education for sustainable development at all levels of education across the world, with one emphasis on integrating ESD into policies, but another big emphasis on generating action on the ground in schools, higher education institutions, research institutes, etc. The decade came to a close at the end of last year. We produced a big assessment of the decade, the final report on the UN decade that you can download on our website. And that final report, into which a lot of research went, concluded that a lot of action has been achieved, a lot of successes have been achieved during 10 years. In fact, in 2014, we were with Education for Sustainable Development in a very different situation compared to 2005. ESD was much more visible, was much more visible across the world and more deeply embedded into policies. There were a couple of concrete success stories. For example, we have identified in our research that leadership at the political level, but also at the institutional level, is one crucial indicator of success for education for sustainable development. And there have emerged through 10 years of work on the decade a number of really strong ESD leaders, you could call them, or also good practitioners, you could also call them. However, despite the various successes, the UN Decade Report has also concluded that there are, of course, major challenges still to be addressed. We are still a very long way away from integrating education for sustainable development at all levels of education and in all areas of policies. And in particular, there were three challenges that the final report indicated that would have to be addressed in the future. One is a closer alignment of the education sector and of the various other sectors that are dealing with sustainable development issues. That obviously has clear implications for higher education. I will come back to that in a moment. The other big challenge that was identified is that we need a stronger institutionalization of education for sustainable development. We did see a number of good integrations into policies throughout the decade, but this did not happen across the board. So we need a stronger move away from individual good practice initiatives and towards an institutionalized integration of education for sustainable development. Also something, of course, that has implications for higher education. And the third area was we need stronger research and monitoring and evaluation on education for sustainable development. On the basis of these findings of the decade, UNESCO member states consulted. You know that one of the strengths of UNESCO is that we directly work with member states governments, and so can ensure that really their perspectives from across the world are taken on board. But once they have signed up to a program, we also have a certain legitimacy to call upon them to implement the program in their countries. So UNESCO member states have come together and agreed on the follow-up framework to the UN decade, the so-called Global Action Program that you have mentioned, and that is intending to scale up ESD actions now initially for a first phase of 5 years, again in all areas of education and learning, of course with one specific focus on higher education among other areas of education. We have identified 5 target groups, or we call them also priority action areas: policy, education institutions, teachers, trainers, educators, youth, young people, and then local communities. These 5 areas or 5 target groups are considered the priorities for the next 5 years for ESD action. And in these areas, we are trying to generate not only a lot of action on the ground over the next 5 years, but also try to make sure that education for sustainable development is properly institutionalized, properly structurally integrated into work at the member state level. As UNESCO, we are at the global level driving the implementation of the Global Action Program together with a group of around 80 dedicated partner organizations that we have identified. We identified them when we were preparing for the big World Conference on Education for Sustainable Development in November last year, where the Global Action Program was launched. And from the work towards this conference emerged 80 strong institutions, from United Nations partners through member states, governments, to individual NGOs or also global networks. The International Association of Universities that you mentioned is one of our, we call them key partners for education for sustainable development at the global level. But then, of course, the on-the-ground implementation of the Global Action Program is really the responsibility of every member state, and not only of every country, member states as we call them in UNESCO, but also really the responsibility of every education institution. And here is where I, for my last couple of minutes in this first intervention, come to the role of higher education. Higher education, of course, is considered by us, by UNESCO, as a key driver for sustainable development, for education for sustainable development, but then also for sustainable development more generally. Higher education institutions are, among many other things, those institutions where the future leaders of a society are trained and educated, so they have a very particular power to leverage action, higher education institutions. Then another reason why higher education institutions are central to the whole effort is that they are situated often at the intersection of education activities. They are teaching institutions, but they're also concerned with the wider sectors in charge of sustainable development. They often carry out research in sustainable development related areas, and I'm sure when we listen to Professor A.Leicht later on, we will hear how that works in very concrete practice. So this intersection between education sectors and sustainable development sectors is another very crucial contribution higher education institutions can make to driving education for sustainable development forward. And then a third reason why higher education institutions are considered crucial for the implementation of the Global Action Program is the following. When we reviewed the decade, we found that the so-called whole institution approaches, integrating education for sustainable development across the many different aspects of an education institution. These approaches have been particularly successful throughout the United Nations decade, So we agreed together with our member states, together with the countries we cooperate, to put an emphasis in the Global Action Program on whole institution approaches. This is the second priority action area that I mentioned, the focus on education institutions, and we call upon them, we try to encourage them, and we also try to support them through advice to, as an institution globally, as an institution overall, to move towards sustainable development. That means sustainable development should be integrated into teaching content, into teaching methodologies, but should also be part of the campus management, should also be part of the wider community outreach of the higher education institution. That means cooperation between, for example, the university administration and local NGOs that work in sustainable development. So I think with this, I've tried to just mention a very few items how higher education is relevant to education for sustainable development and to this big global framework that our member states have put in place. And I'm sure we will later on be able to develop that further. So thanks again for the opportunity to participate, and thanks for the chance for this first intervention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alexander Leicht, for your introduction here into the UNESCO programs and the emphasis that you give into higher education for sustainable development also.